The night was cold in King's Landing, the kind of chill that bit through even the thickest furs. Robert Baratheon, once the most feared warrior in the Seven Kingdoms, now sat slumped in his chair, a cup of wine in his trembling hand. His face, bloated from years of drinking and feasting, twisted in confusion as he stared at the parchment before him. The letter bore the seal of Eddard Stark. It had arrived with no warning, carried by a hooded messenger in the dead of night. Ned's words were short, but the meaning behind them shook Robert to his very bones. "Jon Snow is not my son. He is Lyanna's child, Rhaegar Targaryen's true-born heir. I raised him as my own to protect him from you." The goblet slipped from Robert's fingers, crashing against the floor, red wine staining the stone like fresh blood. He felt his chest tighten, his breath quicken. His mind refused to accept what his eyes read. Lyanna and Rhaegar? Jon Snow? A Targaryen? For years, Robert had carried the image of Lyanna as a weeping maiden stolen by the Dragon Prince. The thought had fueled his rebellion, had given him the strength to carve his way through the battlefield. He had avenged her, or so he had told himself. But what if he had been wrong? What if Lyanna had never needed avenging? His rage boiled over, drowning out his confusion. With a roar, he hurled the letter into the fire, the edges curling as flames devoured Ned's confession. "Liar!" he bellowed. "Ned, you damn fool!" A knock at the door. It was Sir Barristan Selmy, his white cloak draped over his broad shoulders. "Your Grace?" Robert turned, his breath ragged. "Summon Ned Stark. Now." But Eddard Stark would never come. The letter had arrived 2 weeks after the execution at Baelor Sept. The secret had reached Robert too late. Ned was dead. And Jon Snow's truth was now his burden alone. Robert paced his chambers like a caged animal, his massive frame trembling with fury. The revelation gnawed at him, clawing at the fragile foundation of his beliefs. He had spent years drowning his pain in wine, telling himself that his rebellion had been just, that Rhaegar had stolen Lyanna from him, that the Targaryens deserved their extinction. But if Lyanna had loved Rhaegar, if she had chosen him, then what had Robert fought for? A sharp knock at the door tore him from his spiraling thoughts. Lord Varys entered, gliding like a shadow. His soft, spider-like voice cut through the heavy silence. "Your Grace? You summoned me?" Robert glared at the eunuch, his fists clenching. "Tell me the truth, Varys. Did you know?" Varys blinked, his expression carefully blank. "Know what, Your Grace?" Robert snatched the remnants of Ned's letter from the fire, though the edges had already burned away. "Jon Snow is Rhaegar's son. Did you know?" For the first time, Robert saw something flicker in the spider's eye, surprise, or perhaps calculation. Varys bowed his head slightly. "I had my suspicions, but without proof I did not act." Robert's blood roared in his ears. "You knew, and you let me live in ignorance?" Varys sighed. "Would it have changed anything, Your Grace? You would have had the boy killed." Robert surged forward, grabbing Varys by the collar of his silk robes. "And why shouldn't I? He's a bloody Targaryen." His breath was hot, reeking of wine and fury. "He's the son of the man who stole my bride, the son of the man who burned my family alive." Varys remained still, his voice eerily calm. "And yet, Your Grace, he is also Lyanna Stark's son, the last piece of the woman you loved." Robert's grip loosened. The last piece of Lyanna. His mind waged war against itself. His hatred for the Targaryens burned hot, but so did his love for Lyanna. He had slaughtered Rhaegar's other children without hesitation. Would he now kill Lyanna's child as well? Would she ever forgive him, if he did? He staggered back, rubbing his face with his calloused hands. "Where is the boy?" Varys hesitated. "At the wall, Your Grace, a sworn brother of the Night's Watch." Robert let out a bitter laugh. "A Targaryen in black rags, serving at the edge of the world. Fitting, isn't it?" He turned away, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Varys took a step forward. "What will you do, Your Grace?" For the first time in years, Robert Baratheon had no answer. Robert drank himself into a stupor that night, drowning in old memories, old wounds, and old betrayals. By the time dawn crept through the stained glass windows of his chambers, the anger had settled into something more dangerous resolve. Jon Snow was a Targaryen. The thought alone made Robert's skin crawl. Rhaegar's blood flowed through his veins, but so did Lyanna's. The war inside him raged, and he had never been a man of patience. He needed to act. He summoned Petyr Baelish, Grand Maester Pycelle, and Varys before him. 3 men, each skilled in deception, each capable of shaping the future of the realm. Robert leaned forward on his throne, his voice hoarse. Jon Snow is Rhaegar's son. Pycelle blanched, his wrinkled hands shaking. Your Grace, this is treasonous talk. Spare me your cowardice, old man, Robert spat. His eyes darkened as he turned to Littlefinger, whose lips curled into something resembling amusement. This does complicate things, Baelish mused, tapping his fingers together. If Jon Snow is truly of Targaryen blood, then he has a claim to the Iron Throne, perhaps even a stronger one than Daenerys Targaryen herself. Robert gritted his teeth. Then he needs to die. The room fell into silence. Pycelle gave a nervous cough. Your Grace, the boy has taken the black. He is no threat to the realm. Robert slammed his fist onto the armrest. Are you mad? I won't let another Targaryen breathe while I sit this throne. The Night's Watch is no shield against ambition. He's young. If he learns the truth, he could march south one day. Baelish smirked. And yet, Your Grace, I wonder, does the world need to know this at all? Robert's fingers twitched. Explain. Baelish stepped forward. Right now, Jon Snow is nothing more than a stark bastard to the world. He has no armies, no banners, no supporters. If we let him remain at the wall, he dies as just another forgotten crow. Varys, who had remained silent all this time, finally spoke. And yet, Your Grace, you cannot ignore the whispers. If you know the truth, how long before others learn it? If the wrong people hear of this, well, a Targaryen prince hidden in black would be quite the rallying cry for your enemies. Robert exhaled sharply. Then it's decided. Send a raven to the wall. His eyes darkened with murderous intent. Jon Snow dies, quietly. Jon Snow stood at the top of the wall, his breath misting in the frigid air. It had been weeks since he had taken his vows, swearing his life to the Night's Watch. The pain of leaving Winterfell still weighed heavy on him, but he had accepted his fate. As he gazed out into the endless white wilderness beyond, a black raven landed on his shoulder, startling him. A message was tied to its leg. Jon pulled it free, his fingers numb as he unraveled the tiny scroll. His heart pounded as he read the words. Jon Snow is no bastard. You are the son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. His blood ran cold. He looked around, his mind spinning. Who had sent this, and why? Before he could think further, a voice called out behind him. Jon. He turned and saw Jorah Mormont, the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, approaching with a grim expression. There's a visitor here for you. Jon frowned. A visitor? Mormont nodded. From King's Landing. Jon descended the wooden steps of Castle Black, his thoughts racing. A visitor from King's Landing? That made no sense. No one south of the wall cared about Jaime except perhaps his family in Winterfell. But even then, why would they send someone from the capital? The air was thick with suspicion as Jon followed Lord Commander Mormont into the dimly lit hall of the keep. The great fire roared in the hearth, casting shadows along the stone walls. A man stood waiting. He was cloaked in dark leathers, his face partially hidden beneath a hood. But Jon recognized the house sigil on his chest, the crowned stag of House Baratheon, a royal messenger. Jon stiffened. Who are you? The man took a step forward and removed his hood. His face was hard, weathered by years of travel. His cold, dark eyes locked onto Jon. I bring a royal decree from King Robert Baratheon. A chill ran through Jon's bones. Mormont narrowed his eyes. The Night's Watch does not answer to kings, he said sternly. What business does Robert Baratheon have with one of my men? The messenger pulled a scroll from his belt, sealed in golden wax bearing the royal crest. He unrolled it and read aloud. By order of King Robert of House Baratheon, first of his name, Jon Snow is to be taken into custody and executed for treason against the crown. The Night's Watch is commanded to release him immediately into the custody of the royal guards. Any resistance will be considered an act of treason. The words slammed into Jon like a hammer. The room fell silent. Mormont's expression darkened. "This is madness." Jon's voice was hoarse. "Treason. What treason have I committed?" The messenger's lips curled into a cruel smirk. "For who you are, boy, the king knows the truth." Jon felt the world spin beneath his feet. Robert knew. Somehow, some way, the truth about his parents had reached the Iron Throne. And now, the most powerful man in Westeros had ordered his death. Mormont's hand rested on the hilt of his sword. "The Wall is a place of exile. No king, no kingdom, no laws hold power here. Jon Snow is a sworn brother of the Night's Watch," the messenger sneered. "Then perhaps the king will strip your order of its privileges." His eyes flickered to Jon. "Make this easy, boy. Come with us quietly, and it will be over before you know it." Jon's breath came fast, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He had taken the Black to escape the politics of the South, but the South had come for him anyway. Mormont let out a slow breath. Then, to Jon's shock, he turned toward him. "What do you want to do, lad?" Jon's eyes widened. "I don't want to die," Mormont nodded. "Then draw your sword." The messenger's expression twisted into fury. "You dare defy the king?" Mormont's voice was ice. "Robert Baratheon is not my king. My vows are to the Night's Watch. You will not take him." The tension in the room snapped like a drawn bowstring. The messenger reached for his dagger, but Jon was faster. In one swift motion, Jon unsheathed Longclaw and drove the blade through the man's gut. The messenger gasped, his eyes wide with shock. Blood bubbled from his mouth as he collapsed, Jon's sword still buried in his stomach. A stunned silence filled the hall. Jon stood frozen, staring down at the dying man. He had never killed a man before. Mormont clapped a firm hand on his shoulder. "You had no choice, boy. It was you or him." Jon swallowed hard, his grip tightening around his sword. "What now?" Mormont sighed. "Now, you run." Robert Baratheon sat on his throne, gripping a goblet of wine. He was impatient, waiting for news. Petter Baelish stood at his side, ever smirking. "Your Grace, I'm sure the boy is dead by now." Robert exhaled sharply, but something in his gut twisted. Something felt wrong. Then the doors to the throne room burst open. A messenger stumbled inside, breathless, his cloak dusted with snow. Robert leaned forward. "Speak." The messenger bowed. "Your Grace, Jon Snow killed the royal envoy and fled the wall. He's gone." Robert's grip on his goblet tightened until the metal buckled in his hands. The boy was still alive. His voice was barely above a growl. "Find him and burn him out of hiding." The wind howled, like a beast, as Jon Snow rode south, his horse's hooves pounding against the frozen ground. His breath came in ragged gasps, every muscle in his body screaming from exhaustion. He had fled Castle Black under cover of darkness, taking only what supplies he could carry. The Night's Watch had protected him, but only for so long. The moment word reached King's Landing that he was still alive, the full weight of the Iron Throne would come crashing down upon him. The king wanted him dead, and Robert Baratheon always got what he wanted. Jon clenched his jaw as he urged his horse forward, heart pounding in his chest. He had spent his whole life believing he was nothing more than Ned Stark's bastard. He had accepted that he had no place in the world. Now he knew the truth. He was not Jon Snow. He was Jon Targaryen, and the world wanted him dead for it. Robb Stark sat at the high table, listening as Maester Luwin read the latest raven from the capital. His fingers dug into the wood of the chair as he heard the words. By order of King Robert, Jon Snow is declared a traitor to the realm. Any who give him aid will suffer the same fate. He is to be captured or killed on sight. The hall was silent. Every lord and bannerman gathered at the table exchanged uneasy glances. Robb's hands curled into fists. "This is madness." Maester Luwin set the letter down. "If the king has declared Jon a traitor, it means he has learned the truth." Catelyn Stark's face was pale. her lips pressed into a thin line. If Jon Snow is Rhaegar's son, then Robert will never allow him to live. Robb turned to Great Jon Umber, his most loyal bannerman. If Jon comes here— Great Jon cut him off with a bark of laughter. If the boy comes here, we hide him. Simple as that. Catelyn's voice was like ice. Hiding him would mean defying the king. Robb shot to his feet. Then let it be defiance. His voice rang through the hall, filled with fury. Jon is my brother. Bastard or not, Targaryen or no, is my blood. If he comes here, we protect him. Great Jon grinned, slamming his fist on the table. Aye, the Starks protect their own. But Catelyn's expression remained grim. You would risk war with the Iron Throne for him? Robb's blue eyes burned with conviction. I would risk war for my family. A heavy silence settled over the hall. The lords of the North exchanged glances, some nodding, some hesitating. The decision had been made. If Jon Snow made it to Winterfell, the North would stand with him, even if it meant rebellion. Robert Baratheon's patience was running thin. He paced the throne room, his hand clenched into a fist. The boy still lives. His voice was dark, venomous. And no one has caught him? Petyr Baelish smirked. Your Grace, the North is vast, and the boy knows it well. If he rides for Winterfell, it may take time before we find him. Robert turned to Tywin Lannister, seated calmly at the long council table. The Lord of Casterly Rock had been quiet since the news broke. Robert's teeth ground together. Say something, Tywin. Tywin folded his hands. If Jon Snow is Rhaegar's son, then he is the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Silence fell over the council chamber. Robert's face twisted with rage. Are you suggesting I should let him live? Tywin's golden eyes were unreadable. I am suggesting that, should the boy find support, the Seven Kingdoms may have another war on its hands. Robert slammed a fist onto the table. There won't be a war. There won't be a boy left to rally around. He turned to Jaime Lannister, seated beside his father. I want you to ride north with 100 men. If Jon Snow breathes, cut his throat. Jaime arched a golden eyebrow. You want me to hunt a boy through the north? Like some common bounty hunter? Robert's voice was cold. No, I want you to end the Targaryen bloodline. Jaime's smirk faded. Robert turned to Stannis, his younger brother, who had been silently watching the conversation. You're quiet. Stannis' face was stone. Because I am wondering, brother, if you are making a mistake. Robert's eyes flashed with anger. What? Stannis' jaw clenched. If Jon Snow is Rhaegar's son, then the boy has a stronger claim to the throne than you ever did. The words struck like a blow. Robert took a step forward, his breath heavy. You had better choose your next words carefully, Stannis. Stannis met his brother's gaze, unflinching. I am not saying he should rule. I am saying that killing him may create more enemies than it removes. Tywin nodded slowly. The North, the Vale, perhaps even Dorne. If they believe the boy's the rightful heir, they may rebel. Robert's face darkened. Then we kill him before he reaches them. He turned to Jaime once more. Ride now. Bring me his head. Jaime sighed, standing to his feet. As you command, your grace. Robert exhaled heavily, reaching for his goblet. His voice was little more than a growl. The bastard dies, and this ends. Jon rode hard, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. He had nowhere to go. The wall was behind him. The South wanted him dead. The North? He could only pray they would still take him in. But the road to Winterfell was long, and now he knew who was hunting him. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer. Jon gritted his teeth. He had spent his life dreaming of honor, of serving something greater than himself. Now, honor wouldn't save him. Only survival mattered. Only the truth mattered. And if Robert Baratheon wanted to kill him for his birthright, then maybe it was time Jon Snow stopped running. The wind howled through the trees as Jon Snow urged his horse forward, his cloak whipping behind him. He had ridden hard for 2 days, barely stopping to rest. The ache in his bones was nothing compared to the terror gripping his chest. Robert Baratheon had sent men after him. And not just any men. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer. Jon had heard the stories how Jaime had killed the Mad King with a sword through the back, how he fought with a grace that made him untouchable. Now that same man was hunting him like a wild animal. Jon needed a plan. Winterfell was still days away. If he rode straight for it, he would be caught long before he reached the safety of its walls. The Lannisters would surround the castle before Robb even had a chance to raise his banners. If he wanted to live, he had to face Jaime Lannister and kill him. By nightfall, Jon reached the Wolfswood, its thick trees offering some cover. He dismounted, leading his horse deeper into the forest. He needed rest, but more than that, he needed to think. His fingers tightened around the hilt of Longclaw, the Valyrian steel sword Mormont had given him. Would it be enough? Could he even stand against Jaime Lannister in a fight? He wasn't sure, but he had no choice. Then he heard it, the distant sound of hooves. Jon's pulse quickened. He crouched low, peering through the trees. Flickering torchlight cut through the darkness. The Lannisters were here. He counted at least 10 riders moving through the woods, their red cloaks barely visible in the night. If these were scouts, that meant Jaime and the rest of the men weren't far behind. Jon pressed himself against a tree, his breath slow and measured. If they spotted him now, he was dead. One of the riders, a knight with a lion-embroidered breastplate, called out, "Spread out!" He was seen heading this way. The others fanned out, their torches casting long shadows across the forest floor. Jon's mind raced. He had 2 options: run and hope they lost his trail, or strike first. He gripped Longclaw. The only way he would survive this was by fighting back. Jon waited until one of the riders passed near his hiding place. The man was older, his horse moving at a slow pace. Jon moved like a shadow. With one swift motion, he leapt onto the horse, wrapping his arm around the knight's throat before the man could even cry out. He dragged his dagger across the knight's neck, blood spraying onto the saddle. The man slumped forward, his body falling from the horse. Jon took the reins and rode into the night. Shouts rang behind him. "He's here! The bastard's here!" The chase had truly begun. Jon rode hard, pushing the stolen horse to its limits. He weaved between trees, branches whipping at his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Then a silver blur cut in front of him. Jon barely had time to react before the horse reared up in terror, throwing him off. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. Dazed, he rolled to his feet, reaching for Longclaw, and froze. Jaime Lannister sat atop his white stallion, a smirk playing on his lips. Well, well, Jaime mused, golden hair gleaming in the moonlight. The little crow knows how to fight. Jon tightened his grip on Longclaw. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. Jaime dismounted, drawing his sword with a slow, deliberate motion. "I have to admit, this is a bit beneath me," he said lazily, "hunting a bastard through the woods. But orders are orders." Jon took a step forward, raising his sword. "I'm not a bastard," he said quietly. Jaime raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What are you then?" Jon's jaw clenched. "I'm Jon Targaryen." For the first time, Jaime's smirk faltered. Then, with a sudden lunge, Jon attacked. The clash of steel rang through the forest. Jaime was fast, unbelievably fast. His blade moved like liquid silver, each strike precise, each step calculated. Jon barely kept up. Every time he blocked, Jaime was already attacking from another angle. His strikes were effortless, almost lazy, as if he were toying with Jon. "Not bad," Jaime remarked, knocking Jon's sword aside and slicing a shallow cut along his arm, "but not good enough." Jon gritted his teeth against the pain. He couldn't beat Jaime Lannister in skill. The Kingslayer was a master, so Jon changed tactics. Instead of fighting like a knight, he fought like a survivor. He threw dirt into Jaime's eyes. Jaime cursed, staggering back, momentarily blinded. Jon seized his chance. He slammed his shoulder into Jaime's chest, knocking him off balance. With a roar, he brought Longclaw down. Jaime barely managed to block, but Jon kept pressing, striking again and again, forcing Jaime back. Then Jaime slipped. Jon didn't hesitate. He swung his sword and Longclaw's Valyrian steel sliced across Jaime's golden armor, cutting deep into his side. Jaime grunted in pain, dropping to one knee. His sword slipped from his fingers. Jon stood over him, Longclaw's tip pressed to the Kingslayer's throat. Jaime panted, blood dripping from his wound. He looked up, a strange mix of pain and amusement in his eyes. "Well," he rasped, "you're full of surprises, aren't you?" Jon didn't speak. His hands trembled on the hilt of his sword. He had won. He could end this now. He could kill Jaime Lannister and stop the hunt. But if he did, Robert Baratheon would send more men, more killers, more armies. And Jon would never be able to stop running. His breath came fast. He had a choice to make. Kill Jaime and declare himself a true enemy of the throne, or spare him and risk everything. The sword trembled in his hands. Jaime smirked. "What's it going to be, Snow?" Jon made his choice. Jon's grip tightened on Longclaw, the Valyrian steel blade hovering just inches from Jaime Lannister's throat. One thrust, one single movement, and the Kingslayer would be dead. It would be justice. It would be vengeance. It would be necessary. But as Jon stood there, blood pounding in his ears, he heard Ned Stark's voice echo in his mind. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword butt only when it is just. Was this justice? Or was this survival at any cost? Jon exhaled sharply and took a step back, lowering his sword. Jaime let out a breathless chuckle, his golden hair damp with sweat. He clutched his wounded side but didn't move to attack. Instead, he looked up at Jon with curiosity and something like respect. "Well," Jaime muttered, pressing a hand to his bleeding wound. "That's disappointing. I thought I was about to witness my own legend grow." Jon's voice was hoarse. "I don't kill men who are beaten," Jaime smirked. "Then you're either very nobly or very stupid." Jon didn't reply. He wasn't sure which one he was. But he knew one thing: killing Jaime Lannister wouldn't end this war before it began. If anything, it would only make things worse. Jaime wiped blood from his lip and sighed. "Well, Snow, wait. Targaryen, you've put me in a difficult position." Jon tensed. "You mean because I spared you?" Jaime's smirk faltered. "Because now I owe you my life." Jon frowned, watching as Jaime struggled to his feet, his stance shaky but still full of pride. "I rode north to kill you," Jaime admitted, dusting off his golden armor. "And here I am, bleeding in the dirt while you're still standing." Jon narrowed his eyes. "You still have a choice." Jaime raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" Jon pointed Longclaw at him. "You can go back to Robert and tell him you failed. Tell him I'm dead. Or," his voice hardened, "we finish this right now." Jaime considered him for a long moment. Then, to Jon's shock, the Kingslayer started laughing. A deep, genuine, amused laugh. "Oh, the realm is going to love this," Jaime muttered. He winced, gripping his side, but the smirk remained. "Robert is going to have a fit." Jon's pulse quickened. "Are you saying?" Jaime held up a hand. "Easy, boy. I didn't say anything yet." He sheathed his sword and straightened, the weight of his name and title settling back onto his shoulders. Then he nodded. "I'll tell Robert you're dead." Jon's breath caught in his throat. "Why?" Jaime rolled his eyes. "Because killing you doesn't interest me anymore. And because I'm not a fool." He smirked. "You're not just some bastard running from the king. You're the last Targaryen. And that makes things interesting." Jon wasn't sure what to say. Jaime sighed, rubbing his temples. "Go, before I change my mind." Jon hesitated for only a second, then he turned and ran. Jaime watched him disappear into the darkness, his smirk fading into something unreadable. "This is going to be fun," the Kingslayer muttered under his breath. The throne room was silent. Robert Baratheon sat on his iron throne, his fingers tapping against the steel armrest impatiently. He had been waiting days for news, and he was in no mood for disappointment. The great doors creaked open. Jaime Lannister strode in, his golden armor gleaming despite the fresh bandages wrapped around his side. Robert's eyes narrowed. "Where is his head?" Jaime sighed dramatically. "Oh, you're going to love this." Robert's grip on his goblet tightened. Tell me you killed the boy. Jaime smirked. I would accept he's already dead. The room fell silent. Even Tywin Lannister, seated at the long council table, glanced at Jaime with mild interest. Robert frowned. Explain. Jaime shrugged. We caught up to him in the Wolfswood. He fought well, better than expected, but in the end, he bled out before we could take him. Robert's eyes flickered with suspicion. You're sure? Jaime held up his hand. Cross my heart. Robert exhaled, his massive shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. Good, he muttered. He waved a hand. Get out of my sight. Jaime grinned and turned to leave. Tywin's voice stopped him. You didn't bring back his body, Lord Lannister noted. Jaime paused in the doorway, his smirk unwavering. No, I didn't. Tywin studied him for a long moment, golden eyes piercing, but he said nothing. Jaime gave a lazy bow and strode out of the throne room. As he walked away, he muttered under his breath, Enjoy your throne while you can, Robert. This war isn't over. Jon didn't stop running until he was far from the Wolfswood, deep in the heart of the North. He had no banners, no army, no allies, aside from maybe Robb. But he was alive. And Robert Baratheon believed him dead, for now. Jon pulled his cloak tighter against the cold and gazed up at the night sky. He had spent his whole life in the shadow of a name he had never known. Now he had a choice. Stay in the shadows or claim his birthright. His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jon Snow had spent his entire life believing he was no one. A bastard with no name, no future. But now he knew the truth. He was Jon Targaryen, the last son of Rhaegar, the blood of the dragon and the wolf. And Robert Baratheon, the so-called usurper, had tried to snuff him out before the world could learn his name. But Jon Snow was still alive. And now, for the first time, he had a choice. Disappear forever, or fight for what was rightfully his. The air was sharp with the bite of winter as Jon sat by the fire, warming his hands. He had been on the move for weeks, traveling alone, staying off the roads. Winterfell was too risky, he couldn't put Robb in danger. So he had ridden west, toward Deepwood Motte, where he could find shelter under the banner of House Glover, loyal bannerman to the Starks. But he wasn't alone. He could feel watchful eyes on him. Someone had been tracking him for days. Jon feigned indifference, keeping his gaze on the flames, but his hand rested on the hilt of Longclaw. Thena twigs snapped. Jon leapt to his feet, drawing his sword in a flash. A shadow moved at the edge of the trees. Then, a voice calm, confident, and unmistakable. You're hard to find, Snow. Jon's breath caught in his throat. Ned Stark's bannermen surrounded him, and leading them was none other than Benjen Stark. Jon stared in shock. His uncle, whom he had thought lost beyond the wall, stood before him, alive and very much aware of what had happened. Benjen stepped forward, pulling down his hood. You're lucky Jaime Lannister has a conscience, he said. You should be dead. Jon's grip tightened on his sword. I should be, he admitted, but I'm not. Benjen studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good, because Westeros is going to need you alive. Jon frowned. What do you mean? Benjen stepped closer. Robert Baratheon won't sit on the throne much longer. His voice dropped lower. And when he falls, there will be chaos. You need to be ready. Jon exhaled, shaking his head. I don't want the throne. Benjen smirked. Doesn't matter. The throne might want you. Jon's mind raced. The North would fight for him. He knew Robb would stand by his side. The Vale could be convinced, if only for Lyanna's sake. And the Stormlands, and the Reach, that all depended on one thing. Robert Baratheon's reign had to end. And if Jon was going to survive, he needed to be there when it happened. He met Benjen's gaze. What do I have to do? Benjen's eyes darkened. Ride south, and be ready when the lions start eating each other. Jon didn't understand not yet, but soon the realm would bleed. And when it did, he would be waiting. Robert Baratheon never saw it coming. Just weeks after ordering Jon's death, the king was dead. Some said it was a hunting accident. Others whispered that it wasn't an accident at all. Cersei Lannister had moved quickly. Her son, Joffrey, sat the Iron Throne now, and with Joffrey's reign came chaos. The realm was fracturing. Robb Stark had declared the North's independence. Renly Baratheon had claimed the Stormlands. Stannis was gathering forces on Dragonstone. The War of the Five Kings had begun. And in the middle of it all, Jon Snowjon Targaryen was still out there, waiting, watching, preparing. Because one day, when the war had left the realm broken and bleeding, when the false kings had destroyed each other, when the world was desperate for a new ruler, that was when Jon would return. Not as a bastard, not as a brother of the Night's Watch, but as the true king of Westeros. And when he did, the dragons would rise again.